I'm really thrilled to be able to do this and that you guys are all here. Larry's got some copies of my translation, so feel free to grab one. It's what we're going to be working out of for the next 4 weeks or so. It's my hope that we can get through the entire letter. So it's just 5 chapters. So if we hustle, it shouldn't be that hard. This has been kind of a labor of love for me last few years, working on translating this and figuring out what the argument and what the teaching is. So I think they were waiting for my beard of authority to grow in before letting me teach it, and I think I'm about there. So, but actually, I don't have any authority. I'm hoping that you guys just listen and give me your attention, and judge the merit of my translation and what I have to say. Not based on any similarity to what you've heard before or any differences from what you've heard before, but simply based on how faithful is this to the actual authentic teaching of the scriptures. So that's my hope. I think this letter really, in a lot of ways, deals with a question of identity that was present in the church to which John's writing. And a lot of that comes down to the question of, how do we really know whether or not we are children of God, whether we are authentic believers, whether we're part of that family, whether we have fellowship with Jesus, with the Father, or not. I don't know if your experience has been anything like mine, but I became part of the contemporary Christian world, back in junior high school, and the churches that I was going to, it was all about evangelism. Jesus, the gospel, God, all of it was about going out there and spreading the gospel and making converts. And it was very simple. What it meant to be a believer was that you were doing this thing, and particularly being successful at this thing was an indicator of your standing with God. It was an indication of whether or not you are actually a child of God, because if you aren't, well, God's not going to be at work in your ministry, et cetera, et cetera. But, and I don't know if any of you have had this experience, there was this kind of voice in the back of my head that started to get louder, especially once my own success as an evangelist peaked and then diminished in returns. And I started having a bit of a crisis of faith. What am I doing here? Is God present in what I'm doing? Am I really following the way that I ought to? Am I a child of God? Is this what God wants of me? And the more that I read, the more that I studied, the more that I began to see that the picture that the Bible paints of who God is, what God wants of us, and what Christianity is all about was very different from the picture that I had, and had a lot more to do with things like, what do you believe, and what sort of person are you, and what kind of a life are you living, in the nitty-gritty moments of our existential ethical life. Are you choosing truth or falsehood? Are you choosing goodness or evil? And so I start to see there's a real disconnect between how I was living and this project that I had and this thing that I was trying to invest my life in. So that question, am I a child of God, was huge on my mind. And I think that that's a question that's taken years to settle, years for God to work on settling in my life. And I think that that's a question that also was really present in the church that John's writing to. So I want for a minute, let's imagine ourselves back as part of this church, this congregation. It was a young congregation, probably had only received the gospel from the apostles or from an emissary of the apostles, maybe a generation prior to when this book was written. And they had been given the message, and they had received it with joy, and they had spent some time, investing themselves in the gospel and in following this Messiah that they had learned about. And they had, as time went on, new people join the church, a new generation grow up. And over time, memory began to fade. And that new generation was primarily relying upon the testimony and the memory of that first group that was there and that was present when the gospel was given to them. They were relying on their testimony, for the accuracy of this gospel and who Jesus was and what he was all about. So, lo and behold, as the strength of their memory fades, false teachers have come and they've arrived in the congregation, and they're spreading a different gospel. They're saying to these people, well, you may have been told that Jesus was the Messiah and that this is what he was all about, but we were there. We were part of that group in Jerusalem. We were there. We remember what he taught. We remember who he was. And he wasn't the Messiah. He was a good rabbi. But, and we agree with him insofar as he upheld the baptism of John, who called for repentance and a return to following the law. But that's about as far as we're willing to take it. If you really want to have fellowship with God, what you need to do is re-understand who Jesus is, and you need to go back to upholding the Mosaic covenant. And so, there's this turmoil then that happens in this church where you've got on the one hand some of these original believers, and they remember the gospel that was taught to them. And then you have these younger believers that are part of the congregation who had heard it, but they didn't have that firsthand exposure. And they're hearing these false teachers, and the question has arisen in their mind, well, who do we listen to? Who do we trust? Who has the authentic teaching? Who was this Jesus? Was he the Messiah that we've been told he is? Or was he another rabbi? And really, we've gone down this rabbit trail. So, in the midst of that, John, who was heading up the church in Jerusalem, he receives word of what's happening in this congregation. And he decides, as an apostle, it's his job to step in and settle this dispute. So what he does is he writes a letter. Actually, I think first he sends some emissaries to deliver his message, and they are put out. They're put out by these false teachers. So we're going to read 3 John really quick to get some context here, because I think this gives us a really fascinating window into what was happening in this church at the time. So in 3 John, it says, "The elder to the beloved Gaius, who I love in truth." Beloved, and I think he's now speaking to the church. "I pray that all may go well with you, and that you may be in good health, as it goes well with your soul. For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Beloved, it's a faithful thing that you do in all your efforts for these brothers." So I think right now he's referring to his friend Gaius's work on behalf of the emissaries that he sent to try to get them an audience and to give them hospitality in the church. So it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he's doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and, not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers, and also stops those who want to, and puts them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. So what we have is a picture of a real crisis in this church, where some of these false teachers, or at least some of the people in this congregation who have decided that the false teachers are the ones that they really need to be listening to and who do have authority, have effectively blocked any emissaries from the Church of Jerusalem, any emissaries from the apostles, from even teaching in the church and from representing the authentic gospel of Jesus. So it's crisis time. And what John's pointing to is this, not only a difference of opinion, but a difference of opinion that's manifested in hospitality and downright wickedness towards the people that he's sent. They're actually putting these people out of the church if they come representing the apostles, or they're putting people out of the church who are advocating for the apostles to come and to speak. It's not entirely clear here what the false teachers were teaching. And in fact, in the message, in the book of John, he never actually spells out what the false teachers were teaching, what the alternative is. So my take on it, that, they're essentially, they're people who broke off from the congregation in Jerusalem and have decided that Jesus, instead of being the Messiah, was actually a rabbi who endorsed John's teaching and John's baptism, and was therefore advocating a return to the Mosaic covenant, is an understanding that I think makes sense in the light of the clues that we have in the letter. So that's a picture that I think we're going to be able to put together more completely as we go through it. So for now, I'm going to ask you to roll with me on this, because I think we're going to see as we go along that's going to make the most sense of some of the clues that we're given. Okay, so the big question that's on the table for these folks is, how do we choose between the message that was received years ago or the words of these false teachers, especially with respect to that younger generation who didn't have a firsthand experience with the apostles? How are they to know with confidence what's required of the authentic child of God? And to whose message do they give authority? So this is the situation into which John's writing, and these are the questions that he's addressing. Okay, so if you guys want to pick up the translation, let's look at 1 John, at least the introduction and statement of purpose. My translation has this broken up into kind of argument chunks instead of the chapters, traditional chapters and verses. You'll see where there's a little annotation there after each heading that tells you, okay, this little bit of my translation corresponds to these verses, but I've grouped them this way because I think that these verses actually go together as a little cohesive argument, or at least him talking about, one idea. So that's how I've organized it. All right. So, having seen and heard and handled with our own hands what was the original teaching concerning how one may attain to life in the final age, we now proclaim to you that same message of life in the final age. Once known only to the Father, it was manifested among us, and we saw it and testify to it. Our hope is that what we proclaim to you of what we have seen and heard will result in your having fellowship with us. Indeed, this ought to be of great interest to you, as our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus the Christ. So we write to you in order that your hope of attaining life may be fulfilled. So if many of you are familiar with most translations of 1 John, it's going to start with that which was in the beginning, that which we saw, that which we heard, etc., etc., etc. It's one of the weirdest letters because it starts with this relative pronoun that has no antecedent, and it's a neuter relative pronoun. It's sort of like, what is this doing here? What is the antecedent for this pronoun? What's it referring to? What is the it that was from the beginning? And it's not entirely clear until you really spend time reading through the letter and getting a sense of what is it really that he's interested in talking about? What is he getting at? A lot of translations and a lot of commentaries have taken that to be referring to Jesus. So they're looking at this letter as some sort of a defense against like an early proto-Gnosticism, where the issue on the table was, was Jesus human or divine, or does it make any sense to say that this God man came to Earth and participated in our human stuffness? Was he just a spirit being that didn't have corporeal flesh and a body, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so they're seeing that, when John says that which was from the beginning, they're seeing him as referring to Jesus, who was preeminent and pre-existent and eternal. And what John is really going to be concerned with is, yeah, but Jesus had a body and Jesus was human like us too. And the only problem with that is that, he doesn't really go on to argue for that at all in the letter. He talks about Jesus being the Christ and Jesus come in flesh, but there's another way to understand it, which is that Jesus is the Messiah who came in the flesh. It's not that Jesus came in the flesh, it's that, no, Jesus was the Messiah, the one that actually came. He was the one that came. He was the one that was here. Different issue. The question is, was he or was he not the Messiah? Not, was Jesus physical stuff like you and me or not? So I think that it makes a lot more sense, because John's going to go on to talk about and to be preoccupied with the message and the teaching that this church received initially from the apostles, that the thing that was from the first was that message that you received originally. What was the teaching that you guys got originally from the first? That's what I want to talk to you about. That's what I want to remind you of. That's what I want to endorse and say, you need to stick to that. Don't forget it. Don't forget what you were taught. So, with that in mind, I've reworked the translation a little bit to kind of reflect that. So I have, having seen and heard and handled with our own hands what was the original teaching concerning how one may attain to life in the final age, we now proclaim to you that same message of life in the final age. I think it's really striking here, this language of intimacy that he's using. He's appealing to the fact that he touched this, he heard it, he saw it, he was there. And that's incredibly powerful, especially if the question on your mind is, how do I know? Who should I be listening to? Well, John's saying, listen to me, I was there. I knew, I sat at this guy's feet, taught by him. And especially powerful if these false teachers are also claiming in some way to have had an experience with Jesus. Maybe they were around when Jesus was doing his ministry thing, Maybe they were there, listening to the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe they were there and saw his baptism in the River Jordan. But they don't seem to be part of that group that was there, through his struggles and through his crucifixion and after his resurrection. So if these false teachers are saying, hey, you should listen to us, we were there, we're from Jerusalem, we know, we have some authority here, then the fact that John can come back and say, well, I was there, I remember, I was taught, then he's really one of the only people who's in a position to say, okay, I can counter those claims. Your claim to have been there and to have had a firsthand witness of Jesus, it doesn't hold as much weight as the claim that I can make. I was there, I was an apostle. The things that you're claiming weren't what he taught. That's the important thing. I remember what he taught, and you're not actually upholding it. I remember how he lived. You're not living that way. Okay. So in most English translations, it's going to go on to say, concerning that thing that was from the beginning, that it was with the Father, and it was manifested to us. So I have translated that as, once known only to the Father, it was manifested among us, and we saw it and testify to it. I don't know if we have an appreciation of how remarkable a thing it was for those believers who were there at the time of Jesus' ministry to be in a position to be seeing firsthand the revelation of how God was going to make it possible that individual human beings could be reconciled to him. And this was a huge question. How is this going to be possible? I mean, if you think about it, God had set up a system for his people to make atonement for their sins and to have a priesthood, to bring sacrifices, to bring offerings, to be intercessors between the people and himself, to try to secure mercy. But this was an imperfect system, and it had to be repeated every year. And it was an imperfect system that was run by imperfect people. And there had to have been a question, how is it that this system is actually securing mercy for me, mercy that I can have confidence in, life that I can have confidence in? Especially if you're looking at the priesthood and you're going, that guy? Like, that guy is going to go into the Holy of Holies and secure mercy from God for me? Like, that guy steals money from the people that come here, to buy doves to sacrifice for their sins, to make offering. That guy's a human just like me. What qualifies him? Or we're in a period in Israel's history where the temple's not operating. Or we're at a period in Israel's history where, the country is overrun with temples to foreign gods, Asherah poles. They're throwing kids into the fire, There's got to be that question in the individual faithful Jew's heart. Like, I really, God, that you know my heart and that there's a way that you've set up to secure mercy for me, because I don't see how this is happening. I don't see how this is supposed to work. And David really eloquently gave voice to that in one of the Psalms when he, recognizing that, said, there must be another sacrifice that you have secured for me. There must be some other way. I trust that there is another way, but I don't know what it is. So what an amazing thing to have seen God actually manifest his plan for how this was to be, to see the Messiah come into the world. And, although this wasn't entirely clear at the time, after the fact, after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, through the ministry of some of the apostles who were given the Spirit of truth and who were tasked with explaining what exactly it was that God was up to in this man Jesus and in his ministry, to be able to finally put the pieces together and go, that's how it happened. That's the other sacrifice. That's the high priest that we were waiting for all those years. I think that's what John has in mind when he says it was with the Father. The Father knew what his plan was going to be. He knew what he had in mind, how he was going to secure mercy for his people, but he didn't share it before Jesus in his ministry. So it was with the Father, and then it was manifested to us, and now I'm sharing that with you. So this was a truth that was hitherto hidden from men and known only to the Father, but that's been made manifest or revealed in the teaching and life of Jesus. So our hope, if we go on, our hope is that what we proclaim to you of what we have seen and heard will result in your having fellowship with us. And indeed, this ought to be of great interest to you, as our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus the Christ. So to be in the truth is to be in fellowship. I think that's the concept that he's working with here. This is going to be a concept that he's going to come back to again and again in different ways. But I think that there's a lot in this letter that works kind of like the way that Kierkegaard will stack concepts one on top of the other. So, Kierkegaard, he'll talk about like infinite interestedness in your own eternal happiness is inwardness is all of these different things. And he uses different terminology, but in the end, he's sort of narrowing in on the same idea, the same concept. And John in this letter does that with a number of key terms. And one of those is being in something, in him, in Jesus or in the Father, in the truth, being in fellowship. They all have the same sort of connotation. And I think that what he's getting at is there's an identity that's shared with Jesus, with the Father, with the child of God, where they are all invested in the same thing, righteousness. They are invested in seeking and pursuing righteousness. It may look slightly differently with Jesus and with you and me, but there's the same sort of investment. And we're invested in it because that's a value that God places above other values. We share a destiny. We're going to be part of this kingdom that Jesus is going to be one day the king of. So that's one way in which we have fellowship with him. We're part of this group that's been called out of humanity and out of history to share in this common destiny together. So John's hope is that in writing to them and reminding them and advocating for what the truth is, that they will receive it and believe it and strengthen their resolve and their commitment to it, with the result that they would have fellowship together. They would share that understanding of the truth in common. And in sharing that understanding of the truth in common and living lives that live that out, living lives where their choices are made in the light of what's true, that they will share then that common destiny as children of God. And what John's reminding them of is, and you guys really ought to be taking this seriously, because I know who I have fellowship with. I have fellowship with the Son, and that means that I have fellowship with the Father, because that is what the Son taught us. If you want to come to the Father, you have to go through me. So, if you want to have fellowship with the Father, and I know that I do, then get on board with what I have to teach you. So, we write to you in order that your hope of attaining life may be fulfilled. I took a little liberty with this. I think that in your English translation, most of them, well, many of them are going to be translated as, I write so that my joy may be fulfilled, my joy may be complete. There's an alternate there because I don't think that makes any sense. If John's really saying, the whole reason why I'm writing this to you is so that I can feel better. How does that make sense? I mean, sure, he got that weight off of his chest and he was able to check that box off. Okay, got that done. Don't have to write to them. But I think it makes a lot more sense. There's another alternate manuscript that says, I write in order that your joy may be complete. I think that makes so much more sense that he's focused towards their well-being. That's the reason why he's writing to them. So what on earth does he mean? I mean, is he really saying, should we really understand that it's their psycho-emotional state that he's ultimately concerned with? I'm writing to you so that you, in embracing what I have to say to you, can have joy. That's not compelling to me in the slightest. I don't think that the gospel, promises us joy in the here and now necessarily. But there's a number of places, as I was looking at this word, it's kara in the Greek. There's a number of places where that verb pops up. And it seems to be used as a technical term. So there's a Hebrews 12. If you look at the way that Hebrews 12 opens, I think it goes, let's set our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what's going on there? It seems to be saying that Jesus did these things because he had this reward on the other side of it. Why did he endure what he endured, when he had blood coming out of his eyes because he was so stressed? Why did he do that? Because there was this reward at the end. There was this joy that he was looking forward to, specifically being qualified to be the king of the kingdom that God had promised to him, being qualified to be our advocate and our high priest. So the joy, I think, is that inheritance. Paul talks about that in terms of the prize at the end of the race. He's running this thing, he's striving, he wants to get to the finish line because the joy is waiting for him at the other side of it. So more than just a psycho-emotional state, the joy is really that thing for which Jesus strove, that thing for which Paul was striving, that inheritance for which you and I, if we are seeking God, are striving. And certainly, there's going to be a psycho-emotional component to that, but it's rooted in a concrete, tangible reality. It wouldn't make sense otherwise, but that joy was actually rooted in something real, something that we expect, something that's going to be. Later in 1 John, he's going to remind them, look, you have eternal life. So you could argue, well, is he really talking about something that they don't have that he's hoping that they're gonna get down the road if they just follow his advice? Well, I think he wouldn't be writing this letter to them if he didn't have some sense that they're in a moment of crisis and they could go either way. So I think it makes more sense to understand what he's going to say later as you have everything you need already to attain the life. You have everything you need to get there. You just have to stick to it. You have to stay the course. So I think it makes sense in the world then that he's closing out this introduction of his by saying, in writing this to you, that your joy may be complete, I'm writing this to you so that your hope of attaining to life will actually be fulfilled, will come to pass. Okay. So I think it's significant that John is motivated to write this letter to these people that he may have met, he may not have. We don't know if he was the one who originally went to this church to deliver the gospel to them in the first place. I think it's significant that he's motivated to write this to them because he wants life for them. I think that that's something that should be sobering to us. I mean, how often do we go through our day and look at the people around us and consider their eternal destiny, whether we know what it is or not, and just be kind of ho-hum about it? Well, I mean, God's going to do what he's going to do, which is true. But shouldn't we want life for them as well? I mean, I think if that's a value that we hold above all other values, that's a value that we should want for other people as well. So, something to think about. Okay, so let's look at section 2 real quick. So John's going to switch gears a little bit, and he's going to address the situation directly that they're dealing with, these false teachers in their midst. And he's going to address it as an apostle from his perspective, where he's going to say things that really aren't going to apply or going to be, they aren't going to make sense from the perspective of the people that are in that church. But I think makes sense if we look at this as John as an apostle weighing in personally on their situation and kind of giving his verdict. So, this is the essence of the teaching that we receive from Jesus himself and now proclaim to you, that God is all truth and goodness, and that to be in fellowship with him, Jesus, is to embrace the truth and to renounce all evil. It follows then that anyone who claims to have fellowship with Jesus and yet fails to embrace the truth and renounce evil deeds must lie and not live in keeping with the truth. But if we live in keeping with the truth, seeking to emulate the life and teaching of Jesus, then we have fellowship with the Father. And we know that the blood of his Son Jesus cleanses us from all unrighteousness. If, as a manifestation of one's failure to embrace the truth, one claims to be without sin, and thus without the need of Jesus' intercession, such a one deceives themselves, and the truth is not in them. However, if we confess our transgressions, he has promised to forgive us and cleanse us from all our unrighteousness. Such is his righteousness. On the other hand, if we claim not to need his mercy, then we make him a liar, and his teaching is not in us. Let me be clear. I'm not writing this to you so that you may feel licensed to sin. Though if anybody should fall to temptation, we have an advocate on our behalf with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He is the propitiation for our sins, not only for ours, but for the whole world also. Okay, so you may have gotten the sense here that John's way of kind of directly addressing the situation and the false teachers and their message is to kind of snarkily allude to the things that they're claiming and go, yeah, but if you're saying that, then the truth's not in you. Or if you're saying that, then you're basically making God a liar because of other things that he said. So, what gives? So, this is the essence of the teaching that we received from Jesus himself and now proclaim to you. God is all truth and goodness, and that to be in fellowship with him, Jesus, is to embrace the truth and renounce all evil. This is a really tricky little verse in the way that it's rendered in English, because I think really woodenly translated, it says, God is light, and in him there is no darkness. Okay, so God is light. All right, I can get on board with that. That seems fairly clear. But then you have to ask, okay, what is light? What, is it truth? Is it righteousness? Is it illumination? Is it understanding? What is it? And in him there is no darkness. Well, okay. Well, I thought we already had that with the God is light part. I mean, it sounds tautological, right? It's like in this room there are only cats and there are no dogs. It's just, you already said it. So what's he getting at? I mean, it can't be that he's just making this tautological statement that isn't really adding any information for us. I think that it makes more sense if we look at, okay, let's break it up. God is light. And if we look at the totality of the letter, and I think, this is where I'm asking you guys to kind of go with me here, because we're going to see this more as we go on. What John is going to go on to keep hammering as being really key characteristics of who a child of God is, because in this way they resemble their Father. It's things like they believe the truth, they seek after righteousness, they love other human beings, they love other children of God. So I think that then the light that he's talking about has to be related to these concepts that he's going to spell out later. These ways in which the child of God manifests the characteristics of the Father. So that's why instead of translating this as light, I translated it as God is all truth and goodness. Because those are the two big things he's going to hammer hard. And I think it's really helpful to separate the and in him and ask yourself, well, in who are we talking about? It doesn't have to be God as the antecedent. I think it makes more sense to look at it as in Jesus then, because the false teachers are claiming to have fellowship with Jesus and to have information to give this congregation about who Jesus was and what he was about and what it means to have fellowship. So I think that in him is kind of a technical term for sharing in fellowship, with with the Father, sharing in fellowship with Jesus. And here specifically, it's fellowship with the Son. So now we have a statement that makes a lot more sense. So if God then is all goodness and truth, and if to be in fellowship with Jesus means that you're not pursuing darkness at all, then he's making a pretty profound statement, which is that, look, if you're going to be somebody who claims to have fellowship with Jesus and to be a follower of Jesus and what Jesus taught, then your life is going to uphold the values of the Father. Your life is going to manifest the truth of God. There's going to be a coherence there. And what he's going to hammer with these false teachers is, when I look at your life, when I look at the track record of how you have treated the emissaries that I've sent to you and treated the people in this church that have tried to stand up for the authentic gospel, I don't see the light. I see darkness. I don't see love. I see hate. I don't see somebody who bears a resemblance to the Father. I don't see a child of God. I see something else. Okay. So it follows then that anyone who claims to have fellowship with Jesus and yet fails to embrace the truth and renounce evil deeds must lie and not live in keeping with the truth. But if we live in keeping with the truth, seeking to emulate the life and teaching of Jesus, then we have fellowship with the Father, and we know that the blood of his Son Jesus cleanses us from all unrighteousness. So he really gets to the point there. Look, if you're going to be claiming to be somebody who has fellowship with Jesus, and yet you're not embracing the truth as he taught it, and if you're not renouncing evil deeds, which we're seeing clearly in your behavior, then you're liars. I mean, that's all there is to it. Okay. And if, as a manifestation of one's failure to embrace the truth, one claims to be without sin and thus without need of Jesus' intercession, such a one deceives themselves and the truth is not in them. This was a little tricky for me at first, figuring out, okay, why does he bring this up here? If someone claims to be without sin, I mean, could that really be what these false teachers are claiming of themselves? That they don't have any sin? Like, you need to do this thing and you're going to be right with God because you're going to be sinless. Well, I don't know if their claim is that strong, but it would make sense to me that this might be a clue that what they're appealing to this church to do is to go back to upholding the law, because at least then, you aren't a sinner. You're somebody who is actually upholding and keeping the law. You're a good Jew. You're doing what you need to do to take care of yourself, and you're not under the ban, as it were. So I think that might be what's behind what John says here. That in a way, if that's what they're advocating, because if they're advocating that, then they are saying effectively, look, what we need for mercy is to follow the covenant. What we don't need is this whole blood of Jesus and his crucifixion and all that jazz. That doesn't make any sense to us. God wouldn't do things that way. We need to go back to this system that we know, that we're familiar with. That makes sense to us. So if that's what they're advocating, then in essence they're saying, hey, if we don't need Jesus's intercession, if we don't need what was accomplished by his sacrifice on the cross, then they're not seeing that need in themselves. We're not in a position that we actually need mercy from God, such as what's being offered through Jesus and his intercession. We've got this other system that's working just fine. So So yeah, I think that central to the teaching of Jesus, obviously, is that all men are sinners in need of mercy. And mercy is secured through the intercession of Jesus, our advocate before the Father. I think the false teachers are denying this, and they're appealing to the necessity of upholding the Mosaic covenant as a means of making one clean and acceptable before the Father in order to attain life. And if they hold this view of themselves as clean, that would make sense of John's comment that those who claim to be without sin and thus without a need of his mercy make him a liar, and the truth is not in them. So that's, pretty strong language. Look, if you're going to claim about yourself, then not only are you saying Jesus is a liar, but you're saying God's a liar because God put his stamp of approval on Jesus and his ministry. So that's something you got to deal with. I think that on the one hand, there's something kind of understandable about why the false teachers would be attracted to going back to the Mosaic covenant. I think all of us, to some extent, are attracted to performative religions that give us a system by which we can adhere to, we can measure ourselves by, and we can have a specific set of criteria that we understand. If I just do these things, I'm going to be okay. There's something incredibly comforting in that, especially if you have the power of history behind you, you have the power of culture behind you. It makes a lot of sense why that would be attractive and why people would bail on Jesus and bail on the gospel and go back to that. And I think in a lot of ways, the centuries have shown that the impulse of human beings, even if they name the name of Jesus, is to try to go back to a performative religion. I know I was doing it, as a evangelical Christian. It was a performative religion. I was evangelizing so that I could feel close to God and have assurance that he was with me. What are some other examples of that? Legalism, obviously. Puritanism, to some extent. Yeah, there's so many ways that we can take something that may have started as an act of love towards God and turn it into a way for us to tally off our goodness or our righteousness and secure our joy through the assurances of a performative system. So and that's what John's reminding them. It's not the heart of the gospel. This is about faith and love. And this is about throwing yourself upon the mercy of an advocate and a high priest who is the only one capable of securing mercy from God on your behalf. And you either trust that and you live in the light of that, or you don't. But it's the biggest question that you'll ever answer. Okay. I think there's an accusation that was made of the early church teachers. It was made of Jesus that, look, what you're teaching is just sin. It's just license to do your thing. You're picking grain on the Sabbath. You're eating the showbread. You are eating with sinners and tax collectors. And that's something that the apostles have to keep coming back to and saying, wait. That is not what this is about. This isn't about giving you guys a free pass to do whatever you want to do because you got your butt covered with God. That's not what this is about. Should we keep sinning so grace may increase? Nope. So John, he preempts that and says, look, let me be clear. I am not writing this so that you may feel licensed to sin. And then I think parenthetically, though, if anyone should fall to temptation, we have an advocate on our behalf with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He is the propitiation for our sins, and not only for ours, but for the whole world also. So So he takes that as an opportunity to say, let me just put this to rest. That is not what I'm saying. I'm not giving you guys license to do whatever you want. That's not what the gospel's about. And then he takes that as an opportunity to throw a little theology their way, to remind them, I think the church and the false teachers also by extension, of how important Jesus is and how central he is to this entire cosmic drama and this entire plan that God has for how he's going to reconcile human beings to himself. And says, but if any of you guys find yourself in a position where, you're dealing with your own failure, and he could be extending an olive branch to the false teachers, look, we have an advocate on our behalf. There's no reason why whatever failings we may evidence today cannot be taken up by our advocate and ultimately forgiven. So, if you're not familiar with any of the concepts of advocacy and propitiation, I mean, these are concepts that are borrowed from the Old Testament and from the temple system. God didn't have to do things this way, but he chose to. He used, conventional forms that were common in the ancient Near East for what it looked like for an intermediary to go between a people and their God. The priesthood was most commonly performed this function, and famously in Israel's history, you had people like Moses, Aaron, and others, the high priest when that institution was functioning. But their job was to intercede on behalf of the people and offer, a propitiatory offering, basically saying, please, God, take this on our behalf and, in return, grant us mercy. And what the apostles are claiming is that temple system, with all of its flaws, was an imperfect image of what God really had in mind and what God has set up, which metaphorically is a perfect temple with a perfect sinless high priest who is qualified to ask for mercy on our behalf and who God has promised, I will listen to and I will grant what he requests. So, okay. All right, let's see here. So what about us? Do we want life? I think we should. What does it say about us if we want life above all else? I think it shows that we value what God has to offer. I think it shows that we recognize that the life that God has to offer is really the most precious and most valuable thing that we could possibly attain to. I think it also shows that we recognize that we're creatures facing a terrible predicament, that we've transgressed our Creator and we stand under a sentence of condemnation. I mean, that's just the truth of it, that all have fallen short of the glory of God. That's our situation, that there's enmity between human beings and our Creator, just based on the sort of creatures that we are. And that's a huge problem, because God, as well as being a God of love and of mercy, is a God of justice. So we deserve death and destruction. I mean, that's just the fact. This is, I think, the great absurdity and tragedy of our reality, that creatures made in the likeness of God with the capacity for love and creativity, and most importantly, moral awareness and intention, creatures created for goodness, should live and die far removed from such fulfillment. I think wanting life shows our recognition that the only hope for remedying this greatest of tragedies is the mercy offered to us through Jesus. So wanting the life offered by God demonstrates our belief in the truth of God's word and trust in the claims of the Messiah, as well as our willingness to accept the terms upon which that life is offered. It's all too easy to want life, but only on our terms. I think this is especially tricky for 21st century Americans. I mean, we're used to doing things our way. We're used to being individuals and taking our destiny in our own hands. And I think that if there's ever going to be a situation where we actually stand before God and have to give an account of ourselves, and God actually reflects to us, well, this is who you are, and this is where you stand. I think a lot of us, coming from where we come from, are going to say, well, it's just not how I see things. I mean, can you imagine the audacity of that? And yet that's the sort of attitude that we walk through life with. It's kind of like these false teachers who seem interested in life, but who have shown themselves to reject the terms of life, belief in Jesus as the Messiah, and who instead have substituted terms with which they're familiar and comfortable. They've said, no, I like the life thing, don't get me wrong, I just want to do it this way and not that way. So let that count. So what are the terms then that we find in 1 John 1? Well, what we've seen so far is that we have to uphold the original teaching of Jesus. We have to recognize our need for his mercy, and that mercy is secured through the advocacy of Jesus on our behalf. And we have to strive to live as he lived. Now, John's going to do a lot of work to spell that out, what that actually looks like to live as Jesus lived, and what it is that we need to believe that was part of that original teaching. So I'm excited to explore those things with you as we go along. I think it's also striking the emphasis that we will see and that we already have started to see on truth and understanding. There are obviously two streams here that are equally important, but that seem inseparable. And one is, what kind of people are we? How do we live? What kind of lives do we live? Are the lives that we live indicative of people who are authentically seeking God, and seeking righteousness? And truth and understanding. Are we believing the truth? Do we understand who Jesus is? Have we done business with that and come to belief? So those two things go hand in hand. And it seems that you can't really pursue righteousness unless you understand what the truth is, unless you understand what righteousness looks like. Because he's going to say, it is righteous to understand and believe the truth. So they're married there. I think we tend to downplay that understanding and truth component. I mean, it's not hard to see why, living in a culture that has largely done away with the idea of absolute truth, of truth not being anything more than just what I feel like is true for me now, personally, but that doesn't really have a bearing on you or on reality. I mean, it's not where John's coming from. He's writing from a place where there is real, honest to God, absolute truth, and it's what God has determined to be, that it's reality. That's what truth is. And that's what he's asking his audience to really come to terms with. So that should be, I think that should be a real challenge to us as well, not only in how we understand how this world's put together, but what it is, what's vital for us to come to terms with respect to God and with respect to this message. So let's stop there. And if you guys have any questions. Yeah, Karina.
Have you done any thinking about John's Gospels and how it connects to the letters? Because themes like the light, coming to the light, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating how much of the teaching in the letters mirrors the gospel. It's undeniable that there's it's almost verbatim certain passages of what Jesus teaches in the Gospel of John and what you find John teaching here. Some of the concepts are a little bit different, like the light that you see in the Gospel, I think has a different character than the way he's using light here. I think there the light that he's talking about is specifically the plan that God had for how he was going to redeem human beings to himself, rather than this more general understanding of the truth and pursuit of righteousness that you find in the letter. So there are some differences, but yeah, the similarities are really striking. And I think that if anything, should give us confidence in the letter that the message that it's teaching is authentic and true, and also I think gives us some reason to have confidence that the letter is actually written by John. So
cool, thanks.
Yeah.
I really liked your point too about like wanting life for other people, that is something we should value. And it was interesting because if there was any way that I could make sense of the other text like being my joy or our joy, is in that sense, like taking joy in that God will give life to these people if they embrace this message. But I understand what you're saying about the variant too, and that seems like it could make sense too. But I thought that was a good point and kind of in keeping with it. Thanks.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, and if what was original was my joy, I think you're right that it's in that sense, that he would see them firm in their understanding and rejecting the false teachers. Absolutely. And I think that there's a way, speaking of wanting life for others, I mean, I've talked a bit about my own experience and the motivations behind seeking life for other people, but obviously there's a way to do that that's authentic and good, and that's out of my love for God and the truth and my love for them, and not out of any kind of self-serving performative religion. So
cool, thanks.
Do you see any significance in the first person pronoun switch that John does? Bounces between I and we?
I think he's mostly used we in First John for the most part. I think the reason he says that is because what he's saying is from the perspective of an apostle, and he's part of a group. And I think that the real power of what God did when he sent the Spirit of truth to reveal, the ramifications of the gospel to the apostles, was that he did it to a group so that there'd be power and consensus. Not that consensus make for truth, but there's a strength in having these 12 guys, or 11 plus, say, look, we were there and we remember this and we agree X. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're always going to do it. I mean, famously, Peter didn't when he was requiring Gentiles to be circumcised, and Paul had to come and say, whoa, that's, the gospel does not require this, So they're still human beings, but the important thing is that they share an understanding of the truth in common, and they still have to decide to follow it, right? I mean, Peter had to decide that. He did, thankfully. But it wasn't because he didn't understand what was true. So I think that the we really harkens back to that idea that, look, I may be writing this to you, but I'm saying this to you from the perspective of an apostle. And as an apostle, we hold this understanding in common. And so we can say this to you. The other direction you can go is it's some sort of like a royal we, where he's kind of magnifying his own importance as an elder or as an apostle and using it that way. Maybe, but I find that less compelling. So.
Okay, and then just one more. Remind me what church he was writing to?
That's a good question. Yeah, the Church of 1 John.
I'll ask a question if I can.
Yeah.
There's the it in the first paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain again the it and what the it is referring to? Mm-hmm. Manifested. It. Mm-hmm. It seems like there's this mix-up, or at least for me, there's a bit of confusion as to whether the it is referring to the message in some sense, or whether the it is referring to Jesus. How do you handle the message? How do you touch the message? Those sorts of things. I mean, is it purely a metaphor that he's talking about here, or is the manifestation of the message through Jesus, or how you looking at that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. It is tough. How do you take those verbs there? And I think that it was the message. It is the message, and it is the message throughout. But they received the message from Jesus initially, right? So in that sense, it was manifested among them first in Jesus and in his ministry. And I think that then how they touched it and saw it and felt it and heard it, some of those obviously are pretty clear, right? To see it and to hear it. But yeah, touched and felt it. I take those as being more poetic or more metaphorical, that it's describing this picture of the intimacy that he had of association with the initial transmission of the message of life. Does that answer that?
So in what way was it manifested among us? Is that Jesus?
Well, by Jesus coming to the world and teaching it to them. So, yeah, I think that in that sense, the message was manifested in their midst through the ministry and teaching of Jesus.
So why not, when it says we saw it, it was manifested among us, and we saw it and testified to it? It was manifested.
Well, I mean, and one of the other things is you can translate that saw as being understood as well. I mean, the Greek for seeing carries that connotation of intellectual apprehension. So oftentimes that's how they'll talk, as shorthand for I understood something. Well, I saw it. I think that since he's already been running with these verbs that have that really strong sense connotation, I think that's why he chooses. We saw it, we heard it, we felt it, but I think that saw it has that connotation more of, we understood it, we received that knowledge and grasped it. So more of that sense.
Okay.
Just a question that popped into my mind while you guys were talking was, I've just never really thought about this exactly before, but to what extent can we separate out that message of life from Jesus and everything he did in his life? Like, his whole life seems to have been this story, this drama that unfolded. That's the whole thing kind of captures God's plan and purpose and what it means to be that human being. And is that the life? Like, is that the message? His whole life? And is that why there's kind of this ambiguity for us in what is being handled? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, in a sense, yes. But as he's going to go on in the letter, he's going to keep reminding them, look, you have the message, you have the truth, remember what you were taught. Clearly they didn't have Jesus visit them, right? But they had the gospel preached to them. So in that sense, I think that it makes more sense that what he's talking about there, what he's really interested in, is that message of life that I was a part of when it was first transmitted, but it's that same message of life that you were taught originally. So I think that the stress really is more upon what was the content of the teaching.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because something I thought of when you were saying that is, what might they have? What if they have like John's gospel? Like what if they have the accounts of Jesus's life and what he taught, certainly what he taught, but also what he did, and how separable are those things, just maybe something to keep in our minds as we go through. But I mean, I get what you're saying for sure. Yeah. Like it would be, I think it'd be really helpful if there was somewhere that you could, I know this is like, I'm not asking for a proof text. I'm asking for like somewhere that you could find in one of the gospels that really like elucidates, this is the message. Like, this is the gospel. Is that something that we could say, this is the kind of thing that they would have had to assent to be like clinging to that message kind of thing? That would be interesting
absolutely. And I wish I knew more about the kind of timeline of when certain texts were written and what they might have had available to them.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like at least up until, up until the New Testament gets codified, I mean, it was like, underground letter sharing. It was like samizdat in Russia, where you had letters floating around being passed from church to church that people would copy and tuck a copy away in their library and then send it on to the next church. But yeah, which ones did they have in their library? I don't know. That's a very good question. Okay. If we don't have any more questions, I just want to say thanks for coming and listening, you guys.